which mainly kills adult trees. So what we think is going to happen, that all of these indirect effects of a warmer climate will increase the mortality rate of trees, and they'll also keep seedlings from replacing those trees, and therefore our forests will turn into savannas. And we don't think carbon dioxide fertilization will come anywhere close to counteracting those effects. And in fact, the experiment that Peter Reich has done at Cedar Creek Natural History Area, where they have some areas that are actually about the size of this room that they fumigate with CO2, and they've been maintaining a doubled CO2 climate there for 6 years or 7 years now. And there's no increase in plant growth at all. And the reason is the plants started to grow faster in the first year, but they used up all the nitrogen. And nitrogen became the limiting thing, so the net effect is there is no CO2 fertilization impact. Now this is the same slide because I gave this talk to the state legislature. I actually talked to a joint meeting of the House and Senate at the Capitol. And when you're talking to politicians, you need simple ways of communicating. So I made a version. It's exactly the same as this one. It just, you know, worms, deer, and bugs and fires and warmer temperatures will change the forest. So what are we going to do about global warming? Well, maybe we need to start thinking of the boundary waters as being like the Twin Cities in terms of what types of trees will grow there. And for us here in southeastern Minnesota, maybe we need to think about being the same as Omaha or Kansas City. And we need to think about endangered species like the Kirtland's warbler. It's already moved from lower Michigan to upper Michigan. And so now they're managing forests in upper Michigan for the Kirtland's warbler up here. So it's already moved from there up to there. Maybe we can't grow all trees on all soil types anymore. Maple forests in the climate we have now, or the northern hardwoods as we call them, from silt all the way to loamy sand. If a warmer climate and drier climate, maybe they won't grow on the sand anymore. Maybe they'll be restricted to silty soils. So foresters will kind of have to reorganize the way they think and their classification of sites, and what types of trees grow on what sites might have to change. And we're going to have to think a lot more about fire. Fire is a double-edged sword. It can help trees adapt to a warmer climate because every time there's a fire they reproduce, right? And then there's some natural selection maybe for individuals adapted to a warmer climate, because only 1 out of 1 million seedlings survives. So there's very strong selection. If 1 out of 1 million is heat resistant, that's the one that will survive. On the other hand, it might help change the vegetation, and it gives the new species migrating in a chance to replace the old species. So it's a double-edged sword. We don't know what the net effect's going to be. What if hemlock goes extinct? Should we bring in the northern Japanese hemlock? Most people wouldn't be able to tell this as a Japanese hemlock from our hemlock. It'd look exactly the same to most people. And in terms of its function in the ecosystem, it would do exactly the same thing as our native hemlock. So should we do things like that? Bring in replacement species. This is all, it co-evolved with the hemlock woolly adelgid. It's completely resistant to it. What about some of our native species that can't migrate in a fragmented environment? We used to have continuous prairies in southwestern Minnesota and continuous forests in southeastern Minnesota. Now we have little fragments separated by agricultural fields. Yellow violets, for example, are dispersed by ants. In fact, most native forest plants are dispersed by ants. And I can tell you the chance that an ant will pick a violet seed and walk 30 miles further north to the next furthest north woodland is about 0. I mean, ants carry seeds about 6 to 10 feet. And again, if this violet had 10,000 years to migrate, that'd be fine. But it's not going to have 10,000 years. It's only going to have a century to migrate to a new place where the climate suits it. And things like mosses and lichens, very important to the function of the forest and the growth of the trees. They have almost no ability to migrate on short time scales. So here's where we've been in temperature for the last 1,000 years. And in the last few decades, we've gone out of the range of variability. And the question is, where are we going from here? Are we going on this trajectory here, and we only warm up another degree or two? Or are we going on that trajectory there, and we're going to warm up 6 degrees? This is for global mean temperature. 6 degrees Celsius is about 11 degrees Fahrenheit. In Minnesota, we're going to experience about twice the magnitude of the global mean temperature change, as we're in the middle of the continent. So if the global mean goes up 11 degrees, we're going to go up 22 degrees. So the question is, where are we going? Are we going on that trajectory or that trajectory? And this is the one, if we go on that trajectory, that's if we burn every ounce of coal on the planet. This trajectory here, where we go up a little more and then level off, is the 80% cut in CO2 emissions that we might be able to achieve by 2050, which we could do. We just have to decide we want to do it. It's completely feasible. Although people are pretty obstinate when it comes to deciding to do things. So Minnesota is really sensitive to climate change, number one, because we're in the middle of the continent. We're going to experience a bigger magnitude of change than the world mean. And we're also at the edge of the forest and the prairie, right? So we have a very fine balance here, and that could tip the balance in favor of the prairie very easily, which could then migrate through. If this prairie forest border from Edmonton to Indiana were to migrate 500 kilometers or 300 miles to the north, an area of forest twice the size of the state of California would go from forest to grassland. And that is a huge event. And here's one of the simulations. Again, this is from the Canadians. They're pretending that the U.S. doesn't exist, but this is the boreal forest in shades of gray. Here's the prairie forest border. And if you project it through, it comes across Minnesota. This is their projection for a doubled CO2 climate, and they're bringing the prairie forest border in at about Thunder Bay, which would leave Minnesota totally out in the prairie. And of course, our sense of place in Minnesota comes from the fact that we have conifers forest, the deciduous forest belt in the prairie, and it's so much our sense of place that MnDOT even puts it on the welcome sign when you enter the state, right? And even Garrison Keillor, you know, you're on the edge of the prairie in Anoka, where Lake Wobegon is actually Anoka, where he grew up, which is about right there. And it is kind of at the edge of the prairie. But we're the only state with 3 biomes like this in a flat place, right? I mean, in California they have 3 biomes, but they cheat because they have mountains. We're the only state that has 3 of the world's major biomes in a flat location, and it's just because of where we are and the fact that there's a sharp climate gradient from dry to wet and from warm to cold here, that we have these 3 biomes and thousands of species associated with them. And so what did biomes do in the past when the climate changed? Well, this is 7,000 years ago at the peak of the interglacial, and the prairie forest border was over by Eau Claire. So Minneapolis would have been out in the middle of the prairie. And in the last few thousand years, the prairie forest border has been moving back to the west because, again, the natural climate change at this point would be to a cooler climate. But that could easily reverse, and the prairie forest border could start moving back to the east with global warming. And this is just one projection. This is now conifer forest, deciduous, and prairie, and this is one projection from the Forest Service for the future prairie, That's all savanna in the medium green, and that's hardwood forest there, and there would be oak and maple. Notice they changed the boundary waters into prairie. So the boundary waters, it looks like that. Now it could end up looking like southeastern Minnesota if it's warm and wet, or it could end up looking like that if it's warm and dry. And we don't know for sure. Or maybe it'll be patches of each, because there are some areas of deep soil, and surely in southeastern Minnesota, savannas like that will increase in abundance at the expense of forests. I found this really neat forest here near the town of Candy-Ojai. Anybody ever been there? And you knew you were there, huh? I drove through it and I must have blinked or something. It's not a very big town. It's just southeast of Wilmar. It's on Highway 12. And 3 miles south of it, there's this really neat forest, 3 pieces of it on peninsula here in Lake Wakanda. And right there, and this is Little Kasota, I believe, if I remember right. And what's really unique about these forests is they're way out at the edge of the prairie. And I think these forests are 9,000 years old. They're all dominated by elm, and we know, see if I can go back to that.